This is a game where pieces attack each other. If you're not aware of these attacks, you'll make many errors and lose many games. To show you what I mean, let's first go through a typical beginner's game. We won't go through the whole game, just the first 20 moves or so, and I'll be asking you to switch off the cassette every so often to work out how you would continue. Please have the board set up and a piece of paper before you to write down the moves you intend to make. I wouldn't advise you to make your suggested moves on the board. It's too easy to forget where the piece came from and then get the position wrong. So work out your moves without touching the pieces and then write them down. You may sometimes find I don't even mention the move you suggest, but I'll try and deal with as many possibilities as I can. The game began 1. White pawn to e4. Black pawn to e5. This is a standard beginning, much favoured because it already opens diagonals for the queen and bishop to come into the game. White now brings his bishop to c4. Black plays pawn to d6. And the white queen goes to f3. Please switch off here and work out black's move. You noticed, I hope, that white's queen and bishop were training their sights on black's f-pawn. In fact, the main threat was queen takes on f7, mate. Black should have a lot of possible defensive moves. He could play queen to f6, queen to e7, queen to d7, knight to f6, knight to h6, pawn to f6, bishop to e6. All of them quite good. He played pawn to f5. Play black pawn to f5. And work out your next move. Black's last move, pawn to f5, stops the mate, though it does give up a pawn, perhaps unnecessarily. White has queen and pawn attacking f5, and black only a bishop defending, so there's no reason why white should not take it. But first, let's see if white had any other moves at his disposal. The white bishop attacks the black knight on g8, but that knight is defended by a rook, so there's no advantage to be gained from taking it. The white bishop could give a check on b5. Play white bishop to b5. But then black could reply pawn to c6. This blocks the attack and also attacks the bishop, which would have to move away. This sort of attack by white would be called a loss of time. He could have found much more useful things to do with this time. He could, for example, have begun to bring the rest of his army, lying inactive behind the pawns, onto the field of battle. Please replace the white bishop on c4 and the black pawn on c7. White has one other check in this position, queen to h5. Play white queen to h5. This too would be a waste of time. Black could block the attack by pawn to g6. And the pawn attacks the queen, which has to move away. Replace the white queen on f3, and the black pawn on g7. So white played pawn takes on f5. Now switch off and consider black's reply. You could not here have played black bishop takes pawn on f5, because the white queen would take the bishop. Similarly, moves like black pawn to e4 or black pawn to d5 would just have lost those pawns. What was important in this position, however, is that white does now have a dangerous attack. He is threatening queen to h5, check. Now, black pawn to g6 is no good, since white plays pawn on f5, takes pawn on g6. If black replies, pawn takes on g6, the white queen may capture either the black pawn on g6 or the black rook on h8. Replace the black pawns on g7 and h7, and the black rook on h8, the white queen on h5, and the white pawn on f5. Since black could no longer block the check, he would have to move his king, which is always a bad sign in the opening. If you move the king, then you lose castling rights, and that means you can't tuck the king away safely in some corner of the board. Here, if black moved his king to e7, white queen to f7 is mate. Now replace the white queen on h5 and the black king on e8. That leaves black king to d7, to which white replies bishop to e6 check. The bishop is guarded by the pawn on f5, so the black king must go out into the open. Black king to c6. Not a pretty sight. Please switch off and consider this position a little while. Now let's return to the game. Replace the black king on e8, the white queen on f3, and the white bishop on c4. Black's best move in this position is probably knight to f6. This would counter the threat of check on h5, since the knight attacks h5, and it also brings a piece off the back rank. The knight also attacks the square d5, which means that black would be ready to play pawn to d5 on the next move, and push the bishop away. Now replace the black pawn on d6 and the black knight on g8. Black actually played queen to d7 here. This move is logical because it threatens to recapture the pawn on f5 next move, but it ignores white's threat. White bishop to e6, attacking the black queen, would have been the strongest move here. Instead of this, white played, not quite so strong, queen to h5, check. Black should now have moved king to d8. Instead, he played pawn to g6, miscounting. Fortunately for him, white also miscounted. Instead of capturing the pawn on g6 with his pawn, white moved his attacked queen to g5. black moved bishop to e7. Now switch off again and consider white's next move. White's queen is attacked, so he should move it away. Probably queen to g3 is best. White actually miscounted again and played pawn to f6. This move does attack the bishop on e7, but white forgot that the black knight on g8 also attacks the pawn on f6. So black played bishop takes on f6. White's queen retreats to g3. Black played pawn to d5, striking at the white bishop on c4, which now retreated to b3. White bishop to b3. Black played knight to h6, and white knight to f3. This knight, in combination with the queen on g3, attacks black's pawn at e5. So black pushed on this pawn. Pawn to e4, attacking the knight on f3. White moved his knight to e5. White knight to e5, hitting at the black queen on d7. Black now moved queen to d6. Now switch off and consider your move again. White's knight at e5 is under attack from the bishop and the queen, so it must be attended to. Surprisingly enough, if it moved to any of the 8 squares at its disposal, it could be taken. If, for example, white played knight to g4, black will play knight takes on g4, and white could not recapture the knight with his queen because of the black bishop on c8. Now replace the white knight on e5, the black knight on h6, the white queen on g3, and the black bishop on c8. Almost anywhere else the white knight could move would leave him under attack by a black pawn. So white must try and defend the knight. White can play pawn to f4 or pawn to d4. Let's say he plays white pawn to d4. This pawn move also serves another function. Can you see it? Yes, the line of the bishop on c1 has been opened. You may remember the en passant rule from cassette number 1. White's pawn has gone to d4 in one move, bypassing the black pawn on e4. Black can, for this move, treat it as though the pawn had only gone 1 square forward, as far as d3. He can play pawn on e4 moves to d3, and take the white pawn on d4 off the board. Please make that move. Now the white knight has lost its defender, but it has gained retreat squares. In this position, white could play, among other moves, knight takes on d3, saving his attacked knight. Now let's return to the game. Put the white knight on e5, the white pawn on d2, and the black pawn on e4. White actually played pawn to d3, and black moved bishop takes on e5. The attacked queen moved white queen to h4. Now switch off again and work out your move. Black's knight on h6 is attacked by two white pieces, so it must move. Where should it go? Best is knight to f5. This is best for two reasons. One, that the knight has a strong position in the middle of the board, and the second, that in moving there it also attacks the white queen on h4. This sort of thing is called gaining time in chess jargon, just as earlier on we saw an example of losing time. The white queen will have to dodge the attack, and black can use the extra move given him to mobilize another fighting unit. If, say, white played queen to g5, black knight to c6 brings the other knight into play. Now replace the pieces. Put the white queen on h4, and the black knight goes from f5 back to h6, and the black knight on c6 goes back to b8. Black actually played knight to g8. It was something at least that he saw the piece was attacked. White played pawn takes pawn on e4. Black moved pawn to h5, and white pawn took on d5. Black bishop moved to f4. Now please switch off again and consider white's next move. Yes, black's last move was a real boner. He put his bishop en prise, which is a French word used in chess. It means that a piece can be taken for nothing. The bishop is attacked twice, but defended just once. White played bishop takes on f4, regaining his piece, and black moved queen to b4 check. White retreated his bishop from f4 to d2, blocking the check and also threatening the black queen. And now, how should black play? Switch off. This time it's white who moved. He forgot that queens can attack in more than one direction. Black simply knocked off the white queen on h4. Black queen takes on h4. White moved now pawn to g3, attacking the queen on h4. And how would you now continue for black? Switch off. Black played queen to e4, check. White bishop to e3. Did you notice that the black queen could now capture the white rook on h1? Black didn't. He played queen to b4 check. And white moved knight to d2. The game went on its merry way, and I stopped recording it, but I think we've seen enough to know where beginners go wrong. They overlook attacks or miscount the number of attacks on the same square. So in your next games, I suggest you try to look for all these attacks and defences. It will certainly help you to win your first chess battles. It will also stand you in good stead when we go on to the more subtle aspects of chess on the rest of this cassette. Lesson 2. This lesson will introduce you to some of the basic ideas of play, particularly of opening play. The first one is about mobilization of your forces. In chess, this is called development. If you watch a beginner's game, you'll often find that he only brings out one or two pieces and leaves all the rest at home. This is natural because it's quite a strain thinking of all the pieces at the same time. But actually, you need not think of them all at once. You'll find it useful to bring the pieces out and post them somewhere, then you can use them later on. This will be much better than leaving them to rot at home. The second idea that you must have is central control. The center of the board is clearly recognizable. Take the middle 16 or so squares, and they are the center. But why should this part of the board be more important than the wings? One reason is that the pieces in the center command more squares than at the edge. Put a knight at d4. Here it commands 8 squares. Now put it at h4. It only commands 4 squares here. The second reason is that the center is the center of communications. Pieces can be coordinated more easily in the center, and a piece in the center can strike on either side of the board. Other than that, for the time being, you'll just have to take my word for it that the center is important. The third idea to bear in mind is sheltering your king, which is generally done by castling. Now, please clear the board of all your opponent's pieces. That's all the black pieces. And just have the white pieces set up for the start of a game. At the beginning of the game, the pieces are all hidden behind the pawns, and only the knights can move at all. So pawns must be moved, otherwise the pieces will never become active. First move your pawns to e4 and d4. This immediately releases the queen and both the bishops. Now place one knight at f3 and the other at c3. The knights are being developed towards the center. Now bring the bishops out. One to f4 and the other to c4. Both are centrally placed and both strike at the enemy position. Now castle kingside. That's the rook on h1 to f1, and the king on king1 goes to g1. The king is now in shelter. It's particularly important that the pawns in front of the king should not be moved. If they move up the board, the king becomes exposed. That's one reason why the king should not stay in the center. White has got quite reasonable development in this position. Let's note a few points about it. The first is that the pawns at d4 and e4 are helping white to control the center. Between them they cover 4 squares on the fifth rank: f5, e5, d5, and c5. Black's pieces cannot occupy those squares for fear of being captured. And the pawns also act rather as a line of demarcation. As far as the pawns have progressed, thus far is White's territory. At the same time, White has only so far made a couple of pawn moves. This is a sound plan for starting the game, for if the main army is not activated, pawns can do little by themselves. Another point about this position is that the weaker pieces have been brought out first, that is, the bishops and the knights, whereas the stronger pieces, the major pieces, rooks and queens, remain at home. There's a reason for this. The weaker, or as they are called, minor pieces, will meet their equals, other bishops and knights, in the centre of the board, and if one is exchanged for another, no one loses anything. But if a rook strayed into the middle of the board, he would be immediately set upon by the enemy bishops and knights. In order to avoid his capture, his master would have to be continually moving him around to escape the attacks. Besides this, the rooks are known as heavy pieces. In football, the heaviest, most powerful players are called backs, and the same functions in chess are filled by the rooks. The queen, being a cross between a bishop and a rook, has the characteristics of each. She is very fast-moving and powerful, and there is a temptation, especially among beginners, to start off moving the queen around to see what she can do. But at the same time, it must be remembered that the queen is the most valuable piece on the board, worth 3 times as much as a knight or a bishop, and almost twice as much as a rook, and she too can be set upon by minor pieces and even pawns, and driven all over the board. One factor that will enhance the power of the major pieces, without bringing them into danger, is the opening of a file. A file is open if there are no pawns on it. Take the white pawn on a2 off the board. Straight away, the rook has a line down to the end of the board. Now replace the white pawn on a2. Pawns don't just disappear off the board, they have to capture or be captured. So place a black pawn at c5. Now, if it were White's move, he could play pawn takes on c5. This would immediately open up the d file, and the scope of White's queen is increased. The rooks, too, would gravitate towards that file. The only thing wrong with this position is that it doesn't take into account what the opponent is doing, and this will have a profound effect on how you play, particularly on how you place your pieces. So in the next lesson, we'll look at the opening with both white and black pieces on the board. Lesson 3. Some opening formations. Please have the pieces set up for the start of a game. Now play one white pawn to e4. Let's say black replies in kind. Black pawn to e5. Then white could play bishop to c4. Here the bishop is well placed, because she has a nice diagonal leading down to f7. But suppose black had not played pawn to e5. Replace white's bishop on f1, and black's pawn on e7. Suppose on his first move, black plays pawn to e6. Now white again plays bishop to c4. In this position, this isn't such a good move. The bishop's attacking power is directed at e6, and e6 is heavily defended by the pawns at f7 and d7. White isn't going to be taking that pawn in a hurry, because he would lose his bishop 3 points against 1. As well as that, bishop to c4 is defective for another reason. I mentioned earlier that you want to keep your heavy pieces back, the queens and the rooks, at the beginning, because they might get set upon by minor pieces. The same relationship holds between the minor pieces and the pawns, the next one down on the scale of values. For black here can play pawn to d5. This pawn is defended twice, by black queen at d8 and the black pawn at e6. It is also attacked twice, but black will be the last one capturing on d5. White might play pawn takes on d5, and black pawn takes on d5, and white has the same problem. His bishop must give up its post at c4, because a lesser piece is in control of that square. So that is the first lesson about placing pieces. You have to decide whether the piece is effective. In this case, the bishop attacked a well-fortified square at e6. And secondly, you have to decide whether the piece can maintain its post or not. Now we should look at various opening formations and see how they fit into the principles we learnt earlier. Please return to the initial position. Play one white pawn to h4. Though many beginners start off in this way, it isn't a very good move. The centre is not being thought about, and white is trying to get a heavy piece out where he should be thinking about his light pieces. The game often proceeds black pawn to d5, and then white, all oblivious, plays rook to h3. Whereupon black snaps it off. Black bishop takes on h3, winning 5 points against 3. So let's start off again. Go back to the starting position. Now play one pawn to g4. This lets the bishop out on f1. But white should bear in mind, before he moves his kingside pawns, that it is on this side that he is liable to castle, and he will be destroying his shelter by such moves as pawn to g4. So let's play more cautiously. One white pawn to g3. After that, the white bishop on f1 can move to g2, where she will have a nice long diagonal, attacking the central squares of e4 and d5, and even black's queenside. The bishop is not actually in the center, but she exercises influence over the center. After one white pawn to g3, black plays pawn to d5. White bishop to g2. black knight to f6, white pawn to d3, which lets the other bishop out, black pawn to e6, white knight to f3, black bishop to e7, white castles kingside, black castles kingside, and white pawn to c4. This example of opening play I've given to show that many formations are possible, as long as you keep certain basic principles in mind. In this case, white has brought many pieces onto good squares, and his king is safely tucked away. Black's king is also sheltered, though he still needs to bring out his minor pieces on the queen side. Black has also made a fortress at d5. His pawn is supported 4 times. This fortress has been set up to counteract the influence of white's bishop, lurking at g2. Whilst white, by placing his knight at c3 and a pawn at c4, will try and conquer d5 and the long white diagonal for his bishop at g2. Now we'll look at a more straightforward formation. Please return to the start position. Switch off if necessary to set it up. Play one white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5. What about 2 white pawn to d4 here? Black could capture, pawn takes on d4. Then white recaptures. Queen takes on d4. This looks like a good position for white. His queen is centrally placed and his bishops are both ready to come out. And later his rooks can place themselves on the d-file, which is now open. As well as that, he is the only one with a pawn in the center. And since pawns in a way act as demarcation lines, it could be said that white controls the center. Black could not challenge this control directly by playing, say, pawn to d5 here, because white has 2 pieces attacking that square. However, black can play here knight to c6. This highlights the seamy side of white's early development of his queen. He has given black a free developing move because the knight attacks the queen, and the queen must move away. So white's gains have been more than counterbalanced by his losses. Because of this, white's opening, called the center game, is rarely played nowadays. By losing time, white loses the initiative, which, after all, is the advantage of the move. So let's go back a little and try again. Put the white queen on d1, white pawn on d2, black pawn on e5, and black knight on b8. Play white knight to f3. This hits black's e-pawn, and black can play here knight to c6 to defend it. Now white breaks open a line in the center with white pawn to d4. Black pawn takes on d4. White knight takes on d4. I'd recommend an opening like this to you to try out. You get free and easy development for your pieces and a fast-moving game. It's true that white has moved his knight a second time, and thus lost a little time, but not as much as in the last example. And if black decides to play knight takes on d4, white queen takes on d4, and the queen has here a commanding position. You might ask, why can't the queen be driven away by black pawn to c5? The answer is she can, but in the first place, black pawn to c5 does not develop a piece, and secondly, pawns cannot move backwards, so black has left an awful gash in his defences. Play black pawn to c5 and white queen to d3. Now take a look at the squares d5 and d6. What distinguishes them from the other squares on the 5th and 6th ranks? They can never again be guarded by pawns. That means that white has good possibilities of invasion down the queen's file, because the squares will now have to be guarded by black pieces, and not by pawns. In their defensive state, pawns can be like the prickles of a hedgehog, and part of the skill of the game lies in getting past that prickly defensive barrier. Now replace the white queen on d1, white knight on f3, black knight on c6, and black pawns on c7 and d4. Here, instead of capturing the pawn at d4, white could play pawn to c3. Black pawn takes on c3. White knight takes on c3. This is a gambit. White gives up a little material in order to open more lines for his pieces and gain a strong initiative. If you have begun to appreciate piece attacks dealt with earlier on, your next step is to try to engineer coordinated attacks with your pieces, and to this end these open positions are very good practice. A simple example of a coordinated attack is for white to play bishop to c4, then queen to b3. The point attacked is f7, which, by the way, isn't that easy to defend. I think we've looked at enough openings now, so since there are a few minutes left on the end of this side, I might as well fill it up by showing you a bit of endgame play, which is useful to know. Please clear the board and put a white king on e5, a white pawn on d5, and a black king on d8. Now, if white can get his pawn through to the queening square, he wins easily, but if he can't, it's a draw. Let's say it's white to move. So try and work out how you would get past the black king. One clue: watch out for stalemate. Switch off. If you move the pawn in this position, you only drew, but if you move the king, you can win. By playing king to d6, white gets the opposition, as it is called, because he forces black to step out of the way. This idea of opposition is the key to all king and pawn endings. Black must go king to e8, or to c8, and then white goes either king to e7 or king to c7, guarding the queening square, and then he pushes his pawn through to queen. Let's see what happens if he tried it the other way. Replace the black king on d8, the white king on e5, and the white pawn on d5. Play here white pawn to d6. Black blocks king to d7. White king to d5. Black must be careful here. He steps back to d8, not e8. Then white goes king to e6. Black king to e8. White pawn to d7 check. Black king to d8. White king to d6. And it's stalemate and a draw, because black's king cannot move. How to win your first chess battle. Side 2. The best way to learn how to play chess is by playing. For that reason, I think it's time to go through a master game. I suggest as frequently as possible, every move even, you turn off the cassette and try to work out what you think would be the next move. The efforts put into working out the moves will help you to understand the comments. Please have the position set up for the start of the game. We'll be looking at the game Spielmann Reggio, played in Ostend in 1906. White began. 1. Pawn to e4. The pawn marches into the centre of the battlefield. You might think he's gone a little too far. After all, there's no one defending him. But shortly he'll be joined by his fellows. Black answers in kind. Black pawn to e5, marking out his own territory. White moves bishop to c4. The bishop and the pawn complement each other. Were it not for the pawn on e4, the bishop could be driven from its post by a black pawn to d5. Now black brings out a knight. Knight to f6. Can you see the point behind this move? Black is striking at white's unguarded pawn at e4. How should white defend it? Out of the many possibilities at his disposal, white chooses pawn to d3. It's certainly economical to guard a pawn with a pawn, and this move also opens the diagonal for white's second bishop. Black moves his bishop out to c5. He doesn't stray as far as b4. The check against the white king could easily be parried. Black is, by the way, just one move away from castling now. White brings his knight on b1 out to c3. White knight to c3. Development towards the centre. Notice the only pieces out so far are knights and bishops. Black played pawn to d6 here. Black could have castled this move, but if he did, then white would at least know where the king was. Whereas if he keeps his king in the centre for the time being, he reserves the option of taking shelter on either side of the board, according to which direction white appears to be pointing his pieces. For the time being, the black king is not directly threatened in the centre, so it can stay there. White plays up another pawn. Pawn to f4. This is a very significant pawn move. White is attacking the black pawn at e5, which is guarded, of course, so there is no threat to win a pawn. But there is pressure against black's central position, and a possibility of an open line. That means there could be work available for the rooks along the f-file. With this move, white asserts a territorial superiority. 2 pawns on the 4th rank, whilst black has just 1 pawn on the 5th. Note that white pushes his pawn up before developing his knight at g1. When the knight eventually gets to f3, it will add to the pressure on e5. Black could, of course, capture the pawn at f4. Play black pawn takes on f4. White would recapture. Bishop takes on f4, and would retain his spatial advantage, 1 pawn at e4, whereas black can only muster a pawn at d6. Now replace the black pawn at e5, and put the white pawn back at f4, and the white bishop back to c1. How would you now play for black? Switch off here. Black went for a direct attack with knight to g4. He's trying to show that white's last move was too risky and exposed his king. He has 2 threats. Can you see what they are? The lesser threat is to play bishop to f2 check. The bishop is guarded by the knight at g4, so the white king must move. And when he moves, he loses his castling rights, which means he might become a sitting duck in the center. Replace the black bishop at c5, and the white king back to e1. The other threat is actually to win material by playing black knight to f2. The knight attacks both the queen and the rook at h1. This sort of attack upon 2 pieces at once is called a fork. The forking knight is not attacked by either piece, and when one moves away, he takes the other. In this position, the queen is the only piece that can move anyway, so black will capture the immobile rook at h1. Those were black's threats, both against the f2 square. Now replace the black knight at g4. Put the white queen back to d1, and the white rook, keep it at h1. All the same, this is a 2-bit attack, and white should have some defense. How would you continue here? Switch off and think of a reply. It isn't easy to defend f2. White could try knight to h3. But then black would reply queen to h4, check. and white's king will have to move, because if white plays pawn to g3, the black queen takes the white knight on h3 while still maintaining the attack. Now we place the black queen on d8. The white knight back to g1, and the white pawn goes back to g2. White's actual move was pawn to f5. An interesting reply. He's forcing black's hand because this move cuts off the defense of black's knight from the bishop at c8. So white is threatening queen takes knight on g4 here. Positionally, the effect of the move is to block up the game. When the pawn was at f4, there was always the possibility of exchange, which would open up files for the rooks. This blocking is to white's detriment, since it was he who wanted to use the f-file if it ever got opened. On the other hand, white gains positionally by reinforcing his control of the diagonal his white squared bishop is now on. The pawn at f5 attacks e6 and stops black playing bishop to e6 to oppose bishops. What is more, white, by placing his pawn at f5, is increasing his territory on the king's side. Whereas before the pawn was on the fourth rank, it's now on the fifth. However, you may say, why am I rambling on about positional ideas when black has got direct threats coming up? How is it that white can ignore them? Well, let's deal with black's direct threats. First, the lesser threat, bishop to f2 check, to dislodge white's king. White moves king to f1, and now, as black's knight on g4 is attacked, he might move it. Knight to e3 check. This forks white's king and queen, so white must take the knight off. Bishop takes on e3. Black bishop takes on e3. White queen to f3, attacking the bishop. Black bishop goes back to b6. This position should be slightly better for white, though you'll have to take my word for it. The dislodgement of white's king is not so serious, and white has his kingside space advantage, which in time he could increase by moving up his h and g pawns. But black is not too badly off either. He must be careful, however, not to castle on the king's side. That side is more or less white's territory, and black would be putting his king in danger, not into safety, if he went that way. No, he must try eventually to put his king on the queen's side by queenside castling. Now let's consider black's other threat. We place the white queen on d1, the white king on e1, the black bishop on c5, and the black knight on g4, and put white's bishop back onto c1. What if black carries out his threatened fork by knight to f2? We're going to look at the consequences of this move very carefully, so if you want to rest in a cup of coffee, you'd better switch off and have it now. We were looking at the position where black plays knight to f2, forking the queen and the rook. This is far more dangerous an assault than the last one, and it meets a stronger refutation. White will answer queen to h5 here, with the threat of mate at f7. Black has a number of possible defences, so we'll consider some of them. If black plays pawn to g6, striking at the queen, how would you continue? Switch off here. White calmly slips the queen in onto h6. Black might take off the rook. Knight takes on h1. But then his king burns. White attacks once more. Bishop to g5, attacking the queen at d8. Black blocks by pawn to f6. And now, simplest for white would be pawn takes on g6. Black pawn takes the bishop on g5, and white pawn to g7. This pawn is unstoppable. It threatens to take the rook, promoting to a second queen. And if black's rook moves to g8, it will just be taken off by the bishop at c4. Now we place the white pawn at f5. The white bishop at g5, and black's pawns at f7 and g6. And black's rook onto h8. The white bishop should be on c4. When white attacked the queen with bishop to g5, the black queen could have moved to d7. Black queen to d7. How would you then continue for white? Switch off. The strongest move here looks to be knight to d5, threatening knight to f6 check, which will fork the black queen and the king. There's no need to follow this line through to the end. It's clear that white has an overwhelming game. So let's replace the pieces. Black queen back to d8, black pawn on g7, black knight on f2, white queen on h5, white knight on c3, and white bishops on c1 and c4. And the white rook on h1. We were analyzing the position after black played knight to f2, attacking white's rook and queen, and white played queen to h5, threatening mate at f7. We just dealt with pawn to g6. So what other ways has black got of defending f7? Switch off. I'll leave it to you to work out how white should continue if black defends by queen to d7, queen to e7, queen to f6, or rook to f8. But I'd like to discuss what would happen if black castled kingside. Put the black rook on f8 and the black king on g8. That way, he meets the attack on f7 by defending it with his rook. But in this position, castling is a mixed blessing. White's attack is still strong. How would you play for white here? Switch off. In answer to black's castling kingside, white bishop to g5 is strong, but probably best is white knight to f3. Play white knight to f3. In both cases, white is bringing more pieces into the attack, rather than trying to push through with what he's got already. Black must now take the rook on h1, otherwise next move it'll run away. So black knight takes on h1. And now white brings his knight up to g5. This is, in effect, a fork. The knight strikes at h7, so there is a threat of mate by queen takes on h7. And there is also no attack on f7. Black must defend h7 by playing pawn to h6. But since the knight also strikes at f7, that square now falls. Play white bishop takes on f7, check. Black rook takes on f7. White queen takes on f7, check. And the black king has only one square to go. Black king to h8. Now, how would you force through white's attack? It's not quite that easy. Switch off here. The most direct path is white pawn to f6, threatening queen takes pawn on g7 mate. So black has no time to capture white's knight on g5 with his pawn on h6. If black plays queen takes pawn on f6, white mates in 2. Can you see how? White queen goes to e8 check, black queen back to f8, and white queen takes on f8, mate. The white knight attacks h7, so the king can't get out. Now we'll return. Put the black queen back onto d8, and the white queen onto f7, and the white pawn on f6. What if black captured by playing pawn takes on f6? White would then play queen to h7, mate. Now replace the white queen on f7, the black pawn on g7, and the white pawn on f6. Black has another try here. He can play queen to g8, which defends g7. How should white then continue? Switch off. White's move again is not easy to see. Capturing on g7 by pawn or queen, by the way, doesn't work. And meanwhile, white's queen is threatened with exchange, and if the queens go off, the attack is weakened. So white plays queen to g6. The threat is to play pawn to f7, attacking the black queen at g8, and when that moves away, white will play queen to h7 in its mate. You can try and find the defense for black in this position if you like. I don't think he has any. So that just about winds up the analysis of black's castling. You might be thinking that this is rather a lot of analysis, and white must have been brilliant to see all of it, but the answer is he didn't. Every chess player builds up experience from observing patterns of play in earlier games. And when white played pawn to f5, he did a certain amount of calculation, but he didn't work out everything down to the last detail. He just knew that certain positions were good for him, and expected to be able to find the moves when he came to them. It must be time for another tea break, so switch off here, and we'll go through the rest of the game when you get back. We got as far as move 6 in the master game, so I'll run through it up to there if you'll reset the pieces. One, white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white bishop to c4, black knight to f6, white pawn to d3, black bishop to c5, white knight to c3, black pawn to d6, white pawn to f4, black knight to g4, and white pawn to f5. In answer to white pawn to f5, black actually played queen to h4 check. White blocked the attack with pawn to g3, attacking the black queen, which moved back to h5, still guarding the knight. White now moved pawn to h3, attacking the knight. How would you now continue for black? Black's knight is attacked, but it just can't move anywhere. If it moves, it must move to f6 to guard the black queen. White could then continue knight to f3. And black's queen is in distress, since white threatens rook to rook 2, followed by white pawn to g4, which will actually trap the black queen. So black had to try another move. We placed the white rook at h1, the white knight on f3 goes back to g1, put the white pawn back onto g3, and the black knight onto g4, and keep the black queen on h5. Black played instead bishop takes on g1, and white played queen takes knight on g4. Black queen takes on g4, and white pawn takes on g4. The black bishop on g1 is attacked, so it retreated to b6. Now white has got an open file, the h-file, and his rook is well placed there. The black rook on h8 can't move away, because white's rook is attacking the pawn at h7. In normal circumstances, white would continue developing here, say by bishop to d2 and then castling queenside. But he sees a way to make immediate use of the open file. He plays white pawn to g5. Black develops a piece. Black knight to c6. And now how would you play? Switch off here. White played pawn to g6 here. It's true that this pawn is attacked by two pawns at h7 and f7, and defended only by the pawn at f5, but white is taking advantage of a tactical motive, which is called a pin. The black pawn at h7 is pinned, because if black plays pawn on h7 takes on g6, white would take off the rook on h8 with check. You've seen examples of pins earlier on in this game. Like the knight fork, it's an important part of tactical play. Now we place the white rook on h1 and the white pawn on g6, the black rook on h8 and the black pawn on h7. Since white is threatening to capture on h7 or f7 with his pawn at g6, black played pawn on f7 takes on g6. White pawn on f5 took on g6. And now black moved pawn to h6. With this move, black barricades the h-file. The pawn at h6 is guarded now by the pawn on g7, and it seems white can make no more progress along the h-file. So switch off and consider how you would continue here. White actually played rook takes on h6. An astonishing move, because it looks like he's given up a rook worth 5 points for a pawn worth only 1 point. But white has seen further. If black captures the rook, play pawn on g7 takes the rook on h6, white moves pawn to g7. The path of the pawn has been cleared, and it goes through the queen. The pawn attacks the rook at h8, and black cannot move his rook in front of the pawn to g8 because of white's bishop on c4. So black would have to move rook to f8. Now white could play bishop takes on h6, and black is ruined, because when the pawn takes the rook next move, it will be defended by the bishop at h6. Put the white bishop onto c1, white rook onto h1, white pawn onto g6, black rook onto h8, and black pawns onto g7 and h6. Let's look at the position a little more. If you didn't see rook takes on h6, you might still have found some quite good ordinary moves like bishop to d2. Or you could have played rook to f1 to try and invade along the f-file, which was opened by the last pawn exchange. You might also have thought of the idea of sacrificing on h6, but decided to do it with a bishop. Play white bishop takes on h6. This will work if black just captures the bishop with his pawn, because white's pawn will then again go through. But there is a disadvantage to bishop takes on h6. That is, that the bishop itself is pinned. You can't move because the black rook on h8 would then capture white's unguarded rook on h1. And black can take advantage of the pin. He can play bishop to e3 here. This is another striking move. The bishop is putting itself under attack. But if white plays bishop takes on e3, black replies rook takes on h1 check. White king moves to d2. Then black even knocks off the other rook on a1. A profitable deal. After that digression, let's return to the game. Replace the black rook on h8. White's rooks on a1 and h1. The black bishop on b6. White bishop on c1. White king on e1. And a black pawn on h6. In the game, white played rook takes on h6. Black rook took on h6, and white bishop takes on h6. If black captures the bishop with the pawn here, there are similar variations to the ones we've just looked at. Black, therefore, did not take the bishop, but played his knight to e7. This attacks white's pawn at g6. So white defended it with bishop to f7, check. And the black king moved to f8, at the same time guarding the pawn on g7. Black is now actually threatening to take the white bishop at h6, so white moved it away, bishop to g5. Black replied bishop to g4, bringing out a piece, and also hoping to come round the back and pick up the white pawn at g6, for it is this pawn that's worrying him. He wants to play bishop to h5 and then bishop takes pawn on g6. How would you now play for white? Switch off. White played king to d2 here. He sees an ideal deployment for his rook on the open files of the king side. Incidentally, this will be the last white piece to be developed. Black continued bishop to h5, attacking the white pawn at g6, and hoping white would relieve his burden by taking the knight off on e7 with his bishop. How would you now play for white? Switch off. White had two powerful moves here. He could play rook to h1, attacking the bishop at h5. Then, if the bishop takes pawn on g6, white plays rook to h8, check. Black king takes bishop on f7, and the white rook takes the rook on a8. This last maneuver, by the way, is called a skewer. It's another tactical motive, similar to the fork and the pin. Here, one piece is attacked, in this case the king, and when the king gets out of the way, the rook standing behind it is lost. In this position, white would have gained 5 points against 4. All the same, black can still put up a stubborn defense in the rest of the game. So white looked round for something better. We placed the white rook at a1, the black rook at a8, the black king at f8, white bishop onto f7, black bishop onto h5, and put the white pawn back onto g6. White played his rook to the other open file because he sees at the other end there's a black king. This move has a definite advantage in that black dare not capture the pawn at g6 now, without loss of material. If, for example, he plays bishop takes pawn on g6, white recaptures the bishop with his bishop, announcing check, discovered check from the rook at f1. Black, short of good moves, played pawn to c6 here. This has the virtue of at least preventing white's knight from coming to d5 to join the attack. White's position looks pretty formidable. 2 bishops, a rook and a pawn, all in action together against the black king. You might like to switch off here and work out the next blow. White has at least 3 good lines. One a mating attack, the other an invasion of territory, the third simply wins the piece. First, the invasion. White can play bishop to b3, discovered check. Black king to e8. White bishop takes on e7. Black king takes on e7. White rook to f7 check. This is the invasion. Black king to e8, and now white rook takes on g7. White has the threat of rook to g8 check here, skewering the rook at a8. So black moves rook to d8. The win is still simple. White rook to g8 check, black king to e7, white rook takes on d8, black bishop takes on d8, white pawn to g7, and black will have to give up a piece to stop the pawn from queening. Now let's look at the second line white had. We place the black rook on a8, black bishop onto b6, black king onto f8, black knight to e7, black pawn on g7, white bishop on f7, white pawn on g6, white rook on f1, and white bishop on g5. White could also play bishop to e6, discovered check here. If black plays king to e8, white would then switch to the other file, rook to h1. If black's bishop then moves, say he plays bishop takes on g6, white rook to h8 check, black knight to g8, white rook takes on g8, and it's mate. In the game, white plays another continuation. We place the white rook on f1, white bishop on f7, white pawn on g6, black bishop on h5, black king on f8, and black knight on e7. He played the delicate pawn to g4 here, and black straightaway resigned. That is, he gave up. Black saw that if he played bishop takes on g4, white plays bishop to e6 discovered check, black king to e8, white bishop takes on g4, leaving black a piece down. And if you're a piece down in master chess, the loss is a formality, so you might as well shorten the agony by resigning. But to a beginner, this might seem a premature resignation, and I wouldn't suggest you give up hope against another beginner in this position. Play on to the bitter end, in fact. You'll know, however, that you're getting good when you begin to win your games easily after you've won material. But if an extra knight means nothing to you, then you still have a long way to go. In this position, black is not just a piece down, he's got a bad game as well, and he will suffer further losses fairly soon. It wouldn't be so bad if he could capture the white pawn at g6 by playing knight takes on g6. But then white would play bishop to h5, pinning the knight against the king. There is no one who can come to the aid of that knight, and he is lost. Replace black's knight on e7, white's bishop on g4, and white's pawn on g6. In this position, white still retains his threats of invasion onto f7, taking off the g-pawn and queening his own, and he also has rook h1, threatening mate on h8. So black's position is pretty hopeless.